I'm Stacey King and your host. If you listen in often, you'll meet some really inspiring people that I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the years. Some will share success in business, while others will talk about some pretty big personal challenges that they faced. But all of them are pretty awesome, and I can't be more excited for you to meet them and hear their stories. If you're like me and life is a balancing act, then join me as we talk about this wobbly life. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My special guest today is Rick Hale. In 1996, Rick left behind his dream of making it big in the music business and launched a career in real estate. And he's never looked back. As a top producing agent and then launching and operating Keller Williams Realty offices, he continued to expand his reach and deepen his impact, including leading 8 offices as the operating partner. His team of realtors was recently honored as one of the top performing teams in the country. And in a single year, his group of agencies sold approximately 12,000 homes, exceeding $3.4 billion in revenue, all while still performing and recording rock music with his friends. Although it sounds like he's had an easy life, if you dig a little deeper and read his book, you'll learn that Rick's life has been nothing of the sort. His childhood was tough. His parents were not involved in his life, and he moved around the country and even lived out of the country for several years. For this reason, Rick is involved in organizations to assist at-risk children and adolescents, including Camp Grace, which provides summer camp adventures for disadvantaged kids. His goal with these young people is to do the same as it is for his agents in all the businesses that he's trained, to inspire them to dream bigger and to reach their full potential. Rick and his wife, Pauline, have 4 adult sons, Corey, Alex, Tyler, and Luke. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you. So happy to be here. Thank you, Stacey.
You're welcome. I'm so excited to have you here. I've been just excited to talk with you because you and I met, I would say, gosh, it's been probably 6, 7 years ago. And you're just one of those people that you don't easily forget. Let's just put it that way. You have a presence. And from the moment that I met you, we were doing a video project when I met you, and deliver what you want to say so eloquently and so easily. It was really impressive. I can imagine that you've led a lot of people and that you come off being a very strong leader. And that's why I felt it was important to talk with you, because we can all learn from really strong and wonderful leaders.
Oh, I appreciate that. And you set the bar high now, so I better be really eloquent today, particularly smooth in my delivery. But honestly, I think it's the product of a life that didn't just show up easy and I had to overcome it. It's practice make perfect. I don't think I was born with the gift of oration or connecting and communicating. I think it became honestly a necessity for me to feel love. I recognized early on that I had to give love and connect well, and we're all work in progress. For that end, thank you for the compliment, and excited to share a little bit, because you're right. I did write a book, and it was one of those things that didn't happen overnight. And what I found about everything in life that matters, that's really difficult or challenging, they don't happen fast. They're slow and then sudden. And so the book took 10 years to write. And then truthfully, it took 40 years to live a life that, to the point where I felt like I had a story worth telling. So it didn't happen overnight. And again, nothing worth having happens overnight. And the part I find interesting in most people's lives and in coaching and consulting is they quit right before the magic happens. They give up, or they don't. And it's one more swing, one more step that keeps the momentum going, that keeps you going. And then one day you wake up on the other side of it. To the outside world, it looks easy because you showed up with the product and you're like, hey, look what I did. They don't recognize the late nights and the early mornings and the effort and the blood, sweat, and tears. And so I'm excited to be here, and I'm happy to share the story.
Yeah, let's dive in. I've been reading the book and I just can't wait to get further into it with you. Like you said, everyone who's an entrepreneur knows those late hours, and they know how much work that you do and how you worry constantly. And would love for you to share your advice with those of us who are in the thick of it. So let's get started.
Absolutely.
So why did you write the book? And tell me what you wanted to accomplish with it.
So that's a great question. And I've been speaking a lot. I'm on tour right now, and especially real estate sales and organizations where entrepreneurship is part of the DNA, and internally what makes their team great. And that audience bodes well for me. I like big thinkers and I like dreamers. And that can be anyone, by the way. It doesn't have to be sales, marketing, or an organization that promotes a product. But at the same time, there is a mindset that I think hears well in terms of the things I want to share and the things that have impacted me. I want people that wake up every day hungry and want to wake up inspired and go to bed fulfilled, and then fill that gap with something that matters. And anyway, I wrote the book for a few reasons. One, my family has a pretty storied history and some interesting events happened, if you will. And I'm happy to share some of those. But one quick example, my grandfather and grandmother were escaping communism in the 40s. And they were in a train station in Munich, Germany, when the Allied forces started bombing the train station. And the alarms went off. And I just can't imagine the pandemonium and the stress that they were feeling. They were 19 and 21 years old, dragging a couple babies along the way, and ran through, not a couple, they had one child. They were but they ran under trains to get away from the bombs, because the only way to get away, there were apparently 10 or 15 trains lined up to leave and depart, going in different directions. And trains were a major mode of transportation in that era. And you couldn't go around them. So to get away fastest, you had to go under them. And a bomb apparently struck, and it shifted the train, and it took my grandmother's leg off at the knee. And in the middle of all this chaos, she's half leg. When my granddad, the story goes, he picked her up, grabbed her leg, and ran through the snow, holding a child and her into a veterinarian clinic, and carterized it and sealed it. And thankfully, he had some skill, and he was training to be a veterinarian, ironically, which I guess would explain why he found a veterinarian clinic and it felt comfortable to go into there. But of all places to take care of something that traumatic, and I can't imagine. But the point in that is, I know the story and I know what led up to it and what they were trying to accomplish and do. But I don't know that 3 generations from now, my family will, or 5 generations. Like, it gets lost in translation, and people aren't good at remembering and telling stories accurately. And so part of this was, if I were to write a letter to a younger version of me, what advice would I give myself? And then the inherent goal would be that 5 generations from now, someone picks it up in my family and reads it and goes, "Oh my gosh, Paul, or whatever they call me then. I don't even know what I'll be." It has lasting, this has permanence. And why live a life without the context of sharing the story? That's the gift. And I had to get over the hump, by the way, of me feeling like I'm important enough, good enough, or unique enough to write a book. And the cool part is that I realized the value isn't necessarily the lesson, it's the story, and people want the story. And when I think everyone has a story worth retelling, and you may not have lived into that story yet, and maybe it's something that you're working towards. So part of it was a legacy statement or a legacy letter, and it happens to show up in the form of a book. It could be a journal. And again, when I think back to my grandparents, how cool would it have been if they'd left a journal or a letter or a book? Like, can you imagine how cool it'd be to read something from your lineage 5 generations ago, 10 generations? What was it like, a day in the life? What was it like to wake up and fight the good fight? What were your worst days? What were your best days? What was it like raising a child? Where did you get information to learn and grow and survive? And things that I can imagine today, you're like, technology is so amazing today, but can you imagine 5 generations from now, how we'll communicate? And I can't fathom the mode and how fast it'll be, but the stories are what needs to live on. So that was part of it. And the last reason was that I had to, there was something in my DNA. And lately I've been asking people when I speak, how many of you want to write a book? And I'm blown away that it's usually 50% of the audience. And this is not a unique desire. And then the question becomes, what do I have to offer that's valuable enough that I would include it in a book? And I knew my childhood story had unique merit, and that whole didn't wake up on third base thinking I hit a triple, and I wasn't just born blessed, and I didn't have a trust fund, and I didn't have stability. I went to 10 schools in 12 years, including 1 year in military school. I lived in Venezuela for a year in the mountains of nowhere, Venezuela. I traveled with a missionary for 6 weeks while in Venezuela. And man, that was an eye-opening experience. He didn't speak English. I didn't speak Spanish. I was totally I've had circumstances that some people would say, "Well, darn, that's sad," or "How horrible." And my response is, it was magical, because I had to overcome, and I was almost force-fed humility to see what the rest of the world looks like, so that when I did make it back to the United States, I recognized we really are the land of milk, honey, and opportunity. And that if it's to be, why not me? Because somebody's going to do it. And so the story's cool. But then after a 25-year run in real estate, there's some practical strategies that I wanted to deploy that maybe, again, if it's my kids, maybe there's benefit in those strategies and tools that are almost timeless. They're not almost, they are. And so in the middle of it, there's almost like an operations manual for how to craft a perfect you 5 years from now. And then it's wrapped up in stories. So hopefully I didn't go too long in that answer.
Oh, I love that. And it's true that everything that you said. I have an aunt that left a letter before she passed, and she told our family history. And it was really so interesting to me to read that when I first got my hands on it. And then I'm one of those weird people that gets on Ancestry all the time and looks at all the messages and all the pictures and just trying to formulate who we are as a family. And so I really love that you've documented that for the future generations of your family. And I think you're spot on that there are a lot of lessons that we learn from the hardest of times. And it does, taking yourself out of your life and putting yourself in somewhere else, like what you did when you were in Venezuela. I think it does lend itself to helping you to see bigger and beyond your current scenario, and that there is a whole world out there that you need to be a part of. And I'd love more information on that. So tell me, where did you get started when you were starting your book, and go in on, for me, how do you remember all the stories? That's my biggest challenge. I've always wanted to write a book, and I've lived a life. I have a lot of great stories, but how do you just wrap your brain around where to start?
So I did want to add this. I think, and I shared this yesterday in a meeting, and it really resonated with people. We're all made up of energy, right? And we attract who we are and what we are. And so I think the goal in a life well lived is to elevate your own energy so that the people and the situational opportunities that come your way align with who you are, what you are, and why you are. And so part of this is like a self-awareness thing. And I also believe that there's something called the reticular activating system in our bodies. And that's part of your brain that tries to solve riddles. And so in conjunction with the reticular active, I think in simple terms, your brain is a riddle solver, and it wants to connect the dots, and it wants to fix, solve, and cure. Its primary job, by the way, is to just keep you alive. Like your brain is there to go, okay, don't jump off this cliff, or don't run into traffic, or it gives you clues and, hey, that's a bad idea. And it's not conscious. It's really subliminal messaging. But what it also does is once it knows you're safe, it goes to work on whatever problem or situational opportunity you give it, which a quick example, by the way, might be if horror movies, there's a good example. I'm not a fan of horror movies. My wife is. She can literally throw a blanket over her in the dark by herself and watch Paranormal Activity. And it freaks me. Like my brain, I'll sleep on it. I'll dream about it. It messes me up. And I know, and by the way, I'm smart enough, old enough, mature enough to shake off the intellectual side of what I'm doing. I know it's made up. Subconscious brain does not know the difference between made up and real. That's the truth. Yes. And so the important part about why I wrote the book is also the realization that the minute I decided to write a book, my subconscious brain accepted that opportunity real and started to help me find people, experiences, opportunities. All of a sudden, I'm like, stories would pop into my mind from years back. And I'm like, I hadn't thought of that in 20 years. But that childhood memory really shaped me, or experience. And I kept a journal, and I wrote it, and I would craft it. And I would just track a few of the stories. And then along the way, I took some space interval. And I think it's a gift to yourself when you create. There's a book by John Maxwell called Thinking for a Change. And the problem I think most of us suffer is that the world dictates who and what we do every day. And we don't really build our schedules as well as we could relative to what we want. And we are more reactive than proactive. And one piece of advice is create sacred space every day to ground yourself. And whether it's meditation and prayer or exercise, a nice piece of that, but cleanse your energy of the world's energy and recalibrate your tone. And in those moments, when schedule it, I decided that I would just figure out what the 12 chapters might look like. And by the way, it ended up 11, who cares? But at the time I thought, man, 12 sounds good. And I thought, what are the 12 most important things I could share? And one of them would, chapter 1 was just a brief history of my growing up and what shaped my worldview. And then I migrated through limiting beliefs and how they've affected me, and the impact of fear and fear of failure and fear of success, even, which is a bizarre reality, but imposter syndrome and generational poverty. And so I tackle different topics because I think they matter and I think people care. And I think the gift, again, in the story is that it allows some relevant sense that you can relate to. And then when people relate, their heart opens instead of just intellectually absorbing and reading. And so back to the book, the way I did it, one is I committed to do it. And then my subconscious brain went to work. And then I consciously scheduled sacred time to just work on it. And to be honest, it took 10 years. So remember the slowly, then suddenly? I think it was Mark Twain that said he went bankrupt at one point and they asked him how it happened. And he said, slowly, then suddenly. And your habits, first you develop habits, then your habits define you. And so I developed a habit of building content for the book over a long period of time. I did reach a place where I didn't almost quit. I just stalled out for a couple of years and put it on a shelf. I was the proverbial, I'm too busy. And that was just an excuse, to be honest. But I realized there's a tool in the book called the Inhibitor 135. And that tool changed my life relative to the book. And it was given to me by a friend, and I've used it ever since in workshops. And what you do is you list, what does your dream life look like? What does awesome look like? And then you define the 3 milestones that have to happen that punctuate awesome in your life. And it can be in 5 years, 10 years, you pick the timeline or horizon. And the day that I experimented for the first time, I realized writing this book is a big part of my legacy. Like, why is it taking backseat to all of the other needs of things and people that are important, but not on the legacy list? And how often do we default the legacy list for things that are urgent and seemingly urgent today that next week it's not going to matter? This is a project that I felt mattered. And so when I listed, and what's cool about this tool, people often don't do things because of the things in the way, not because of the opportunity. It's that, like, if you were to say, is opportunity or fear a more powerful force? Most people would love to think that opportunity is, oh, I want to win, I want to have, I want to do, I want to be, I want to travel, I want to see everything, be everything, do everything. Reality is fear is way more compelling and powerful. In fact, as an example, in real estate, when 2 people make offers on the same home, they're not fighting for the opportunity. They're fighting out of fear that they're losing the opportunity because irrational behavior immediately ensues. And so just one example, but fear is way more powerful. And so I listed all the reasons and the things that created either fear or hesitation in me finishing the book. And it's funny, I can remember the list. Like, 1, I don't really know how to write a book. I know how to write stories and I know how to recount them, but I don't know how to write a book. There's an art to packaging it and referencing key people and making sure you're not plagiarizing and that your references are accurate, the flow of chapters and the flow of segments. And anyway, long story short, I don't know how to write a book. Number 2, no idea how to publish a book. Number 3, no idea how to market a book. Number 4, how do you actually just get a book printed and stored and distributed? Number 5, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, how do they decide or just want your book? And so those were my inhibitors. So you list the 5 things that are keeping you from that milestone. This is the gift. This is the magic, Stacy. Then you write out what would have to happen to overcome the inhibitor. And so all of a sudden, I kept thinking, what do I need to do? What isn't happening that's creating this roadblock? What mindset, what perspective, what, behavior? And what's interesting, when I went down the inhibitor list, it was all who questions. It wasn't a what. I don't have to know how to publish, market, distribute, warehouse, produce. I don't even really have to know how to write a book. I need to know someone who knows how to write a book and then communicate my story that they can repackage in a product that looks like a book and then becomes a marketable vehicle. And so I started asking around. Remember the reticular activator thing I mentioned earlier? I put it to the universe, into my sphere of influence. I need help with this book. I'm stuck. I've got 150 pages, but it's just not a book. And lo and behold, I was referred to a person, and then they helped me get us to a certain point. And by the way, it became very conversational. Instead of me sitting at a typewriter, like anyone listening that has ADD, it's perceived negative. I think it's a superpower. It just has to be used properly, and it has to be funneled with sprint. I sprint, I don't marathon. That's just because all of a sudden my brain's, oh, look, a squirrel. And that squirrel could be
Yeah.
awesome, but it's not facilitating the immediate in the need I have right now. And so what I realized, I'm not going to sit at a computer for 10 hours a day. These writers who crank out 3-4 books a year, that's a gift. They have focus. They might as well be computer programmers in their DNA because they have hyper focus. I don't. I have intermittent focus, but I have lots of stories because I bounce around and I listen to lots of things and I'm connected to diversity. All that to say, the author I chose, or they call it a ghostwriter, and really they're not writing other than reforming my energy to make sure that it's appropriate to the book. And instead of typing, I just had conversations like we're having. And I would feed them, today I want to talk about, and this is the area I want to push into the book. And they would show up with 10 good questions. And they'd ask things like, why is that important? And what story supports that in your life experience? And what would you do differently? And how would you give someone advice around this? And that's how we wrote the book. And it really was a who, not a what. And people get hung up on what's. The gift in who is that their expertise is 10 times more efficient, more effective, and they're pros at what they do. And you be the pro at what you do and let other people augment that so that the quality of the product shows up. That's a life lesson, by the way, in any endeavor.
I absolutely love that. And I feel that that's a reflection on, I'm a marketer, and by trade, that's what I do all day long, is tell other people's stories. And I think that there is an art to someone being able to know how to ask the right questions and to pull out the information from the people that are important, that have lessons to teach, that may not be best at telling their own stories, but you can figure out how to get them going. And I think that's a great lesson, because everyone has in their network somebody that can assist them. You just have to be willing to ask, right?
That's it. And willing to invest. That's the other thing. To do something right is not cheap or free. Cheap and free rarely works. You can Google and someone on YouTube will tell you how to do it. But if it takes you, this is another lesson I learned early on, that never trade your hourly value for something less expensive. For instance, if you're worth $50 an hour, why do $10 an hour work when there's someone who you've literally taken their job by trying to be all, do all. And the fact is they'll do it 10 times faster and it'll simply get done. You give me a list of things that aren't in my wheelhouse, it gets deferred, delayed, and maybe next week, and then never. And so that's an important thing. So figuring out what you're worth per hour and then investing in others who are better at it at a rate that's lower than what you could earn doing what your core genius is a brilliant strategy.
Yeah, I agree in that wholeheartedly. I have a mentor that I really has changed my perspective on my business. And it was that exact same thing. Stacey, you're not putting enough value on what you're bringing to the table. And if you don't put enough value in it, why would anyone else? And so that kind of clicked in my mind that I would never take any positions or any opportunities that came my way lower than what I know that I bring value to. So I agree.
And then it's about just setting
strategy.
standards and delivering so that people experience the value you represent. And in the book, there's a whole section on what does it look like to elevate your value to the universe, the world, and your peer group and working peers. And it's skills based, but there's a conscious competency ladder. That's the last thing I talk about in the book, and how, again, people quit before the magic happens, but top 2% and then you out earn 100x the rest. So how do you fight to hold that position?
Yeah, it's tough. Tell me, what was your number one reason for everything that you've done here? Why? What was your number one why?
The big why in the book was, again, to leave a legacy letter. And then hopefully the ripple effect is that the story resonates with people who come from a place where I've got friends that woke up lucky. They just were born with means and with resources and went to private schools and had all these leg ups. And the interesting thing is, I think it's harder to succeed when you're born with everything because you don't have as much to fight for and you have less to prove, at least in general. And that's just again, that is a generalization and an observation on my side. And you may see it differently, and that's perfectly acceptable. But who I'm speaking to are if you put two football teams on the field, and I'm a big football fan, and I'm a Georgia fan. So if it's the Bulldogs, 1,000% rooting. That's my team. I have season tickets. I eat, breathe, sleep it. Any other team, I'm going to root for the underdog. That's just who I am. Like, I don't care who it is. I want the team not supposed to win. And so I wrote this book for every underdog in this on the planet that God gifts me with them reading it and getting something from it to empower them to realize they can beat Goliath. You just have to show up and throw the right rock, and you have to be intentional and purposeful, and it won't happen overnight. It's that slow and sudden. And so I want people to believe in themselves more, because the other point in the book that I think is really important is that although I had trauma and tragedy, and by the way, I do think this, I should have said this earlier, I think people who are even born blessed and just have resources also have trauma and tragedy. I don't think anyone on this planet is automatically, you don't get a free pass on stress, and you don't get a free pass on, everyone has their version of trauma. And I'm not belittling the trauma of those that have a lot, because you see it in the news. There's upper class teenagers killing themselves, suicidal, and you're like, they have everything. Why would you commit? So you scratch your head. So in fairness, I think everyone has their version of trauma. But I will say this, every person needs an advocate somewhere in their life. They need somebody that looks them in the eye and says, you have what it takes. You absolutely can be, have, and do. And so as much as I say I had trauma and stress, those were things that shaped my worldview, created a grateful heart for the things I do have, which I think is really important. Gratitude it's a superpower too. And it's also an elixir for bad days. And I'll say this, like, I think I'm positive my worst day is likely better than someone else on this planet's best day ever. And so that sort of framework helps me. My worst day is not really, it's not that bad. It's an opportunity. It's a lesson. It's a silver lining. But there are people that have to show up at some point, looking you in the eye and give you 1 inch of confidence that you can then put into your reticular activator, your brain, your subconscious brain. The reticular activator then goes to work trying to prove that, as opposed to negative forces that tell you what you're not, which, remember I said, your brain's a riddle solver. If you give it negative information and negative news, it has to figure that out too. If you watch the bleeding edge news every night and you wake up to bad news, it can take hours to filter through that and move on to something more productive. So what you feed it really matters. And at one point, I'll tell one quick story. I was 9 years old, my first trip to Venezuela. My family, they're not Venezuelan, which is interesting. My grandfather was a diplomat with the World Health Organization. And I visited them one summer. My mom moved there after a divorce when I was 9. I stayed in the United States, and I didn't live with her again ever, other than the year in Venezuela when I was 16 that I mentioned with the missionary. That trip was in that trip inside of that year. But when I was 9, I visited for a summer, and we went to this hot springs. Remember, my grandmother only has one leg, and she had a severe arthritic condition as well. And so they would go to these hot springs in the jungle, and they cut me loose one day with a few bolivars, whatever that equates to. It gave me enough money to buy, I remember, a grape soda and crackers. And I went to the pool, which was a hot spring pool, and they didn't go. They stayed behind. This is back in the days when you just cut a 9-year-old loose and go have fun in the jungle. And so thankfully I love freedom, and I was pretty adventuresome. So I went down to the pool, and these 4 kids, there were 2 adults, me, and then out of nowhere, these 4 kids run down this hillside, and it was so lush in the rainforest. I couldn't even see them, but I could hear them. And then they popped out at the bottom of the hill right by the pool. All 4 jumped in. 1, 2, 3, 4. All 4 I assumed would pop up, but only 3 popped up. 3 swam to the edge, got out of the pool. The 4th kid didn't come up. And I'm standing, I'm 9.5 years old. And I look to my right, and the adults that I thought were going to do something ran to the edge of the pool, hysterical, realizing he was drowning because he started bobbing up and down, sucking up water and screaming. They froze. It was like the Batman freeze gun. I don't know if you watch early Batman, you'd have a gun and they just literally put them in a freeze, and they froze. And I'm sitting there with my grape soda in one hand, cracker in the other, watching this tragedy and trauma evolve. Finally, I decided I had to do something. I set my stuff down and I jumped in the pool. I had no training, and I did everything you're not supposed to do to save a child from drowning. I grabbed him by the legs. I swam underwater. All I could think to do was get him into the air, get him up out of the water. And meanwhile, he's kicking and pulling my hair out. And it was an aggressive save. And somehow I kicked as hard as I could. And it was God at work. I'm sure of it. Pushed him to the edge of the pool. The adults who were standing on the edge of the pool, who I later assessed they couldn't swim. That's why they didn't jump in. They pulled him out. He coughed up half the pool, and he ended up living. And it was a pretty cool moment. Even at 9, I knew that I'd done something good. I went back to the villa excitedly, but also anxious about what a weird experience and not knowing how to describe it. But I told my granddad, and my grandfather wasn't the most loving, kind person. He just dismissed it and went, yeah, whatever. And then my grandmother was standing next to him, and she got down on her knees, and I'm going to feel emotion, but she grabbed me by the face and looked me square in the eye and said, you are a gift from God and have big things to do. And you're like, okay, how can I be that voice somehow to somebody who says, you've got what it takes? And did I have the skills? Was I self-confident? Was I self-loving at that point? Not really. I'd gone through a lot with divorces and moving 8 times. And anyway, but in that moment, one person I loved and respected stared me down and told me I had it. And it's funny. Again, you feed your brain a thought, and then your goal is to live into that thought when it's positive. And that was a key moment for me. And you said, why'd I write it? I'd love to be that voice, even if it's in print form. I mean, if I could look everyone in the eye and say, you have what it takes, I would, and then help them discover the truth behind it, because part of it's figuring out what you're really naturally gifted at so that you don't struggle in life doing the things you're not supposed to do. Sadly, we often perform relative to what the world tells us, not what we feel or our heart tells us.
Yeah. And it goes back to, it's the power of words. I have a son, you have grown children, and I've made it a point his entire life to try to speak positively to him and tell him all of his gifts and all of the things that, he's good at, because just what you say, the power of those words, it comes back. And in those troubling times when you can't really get yourself out of a negative mindset and you're struggling, you do reflect back on those wonderful things that people have said. I do the same thing with the things that my father had told me. It really matters.
It does. And the hard part is and I say hard, kids are in different phases, and you want to be authentic and you want to be honest, and maybe they are screwing up a lot of things. You have to be, it's almost like that strategy of sandwiching negative, start with a positive, share the reality of the negative side of the behavior, and then finish with something positive so that they feel like there's hope. But you have to be authentic or people aren't buying it. And that's the part of the subconscious brain that's the most powerful, important part, is that whatever you put into it, it has to want to believe it. And for me to say, I want to be an astronaut at 57 years old, I could say that, but my subconscious brain isn't buying it. And so that's where the authentic piece has to be tied to truth, and a truth that the person receiving that information can sink their teeth in and believe. And that requires some intuitive skill and being open and honest to their truth, and not wanting to be an engineer if they're really an artist. That's part of it too. Telling your child, you're awesome, you can be everything, do everything. That's a lie. Like, you can't be everything. What are you wired to be? And then how do you enhance that skill to the point that the world respects it enough to pay, like you said earlier, what you're truly worth, because that's your core genius.
Yeah, love that. And in the beginning of your book, I think it's your father that said, son, you suffer a distinct lack of failure in your life. And that was poignant to you because it did set you up for where you're going and what you were doing. Tell me a little bit about that story, because I really loved reading that part.
So thank you for bringing that up. So it was my stepfather, and he came to visit me, and I was in my mid 20s, 24, 5, somewhere in that range, and I was doing well. I'd already bought my first house. I owned a car and a motorcycle and guitars. I was in bands, and I had a cool job where I only had to work 6 hours at 6 hours a day. And it was running a crew door to door selling subscriptions to the paper. But in 1993 and 4, making $60,000 a year was big money. And I was living this rock star life. I was jamming with a band at night, and I could get up when I wanted. I'd work evenings and home by 10, ready to go out and have fun, and living the life of a 25-year-old. And when he visited, he looked around, and it felt dismissive of where I was and what I did. I was doing there's a term called house hacking, where you buy a house, you live in one room, you rent out 3 rooms, and they pay all your mortgage. And I was doing house hacking before it was a thing. And now there's books on it. And I thought I was the smartest person on the block, to be honest, at 25, and who doesn't at 25? But he looked me in the eye and he said, you suffer a distinct lack of failure. And at the time, it felt like an insult, and it was troubling because I was so proud just to be self-accomplished, and at least at my age, relative to my peer group. And after reflection, I realized what he was saying was not that I wasn't doing well. I just wasn't doing as well as I could relative to my personal potential. And ultimately, who cares if you're winning if you're not reaching your potential? It's your potential that matters most. And so it did light a fire. And I started realizing that I was, even though it looked like success, I was living a life of safety. And I was picking the predictable things that weren't risk oriented and didn't create a big payoff because of personal growth, experience, and partnerships with people that are doing way more than, no matter where you are, there's someone just in front of you that if you role model, you could double down and probably experience something greater. That's what led me to real estate. I realized that I was fishing in a small pond, and I needed to be in a bigger pond with bigger fish, and then learn to fish with big tackle and go catch big ones. And that's what led me to real estate. And from there, it was all downhill in a good way. I realized how much I love people and helping and consulting and serving. And I love architecture. And back to that, once you find what you're good at and what you love, and that also serves humanity and people, that's an undeniable, awesome path to be on. And so I found my tribe. This is who I am, where I am, and who I'm supposed to work with. And from there, the opportunity for Keller Williams Realty as a franchise owner showed up because of a relationship in the office with a friend who was a competitor. Truthfully, he and I worked the same market. But when he opened his first office, I didn't even know about it until he pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I'm investing in this company, and I'd love for you to be my first partner." And changed my life. Once I realized the path of equity and passive income and building a team and leveraging my time with talented people around me, the whole world changed, which a lot of the book, as you read through it, you'll see that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants and people who've been there and done it. And I've avoided a lot of pain and pitfalls just by following a scripted scenario and a blueprint.
Amazing. And it is true that there's power in relationships. And I think a lot of people, especially after COVID times when everybody has been on their own, and I, for one, struggle with it because I work from home. I'm at home all the time. So I'm very purposeful on doing these types of things. I get to have conversations with other people and I get to learn from other people. And I think that everyone has to be purposeful on finding those key people in your lives that will give you lessons and will pour into you and that will take time with you, because you do take something away from every single person, right? And I think that's a gift if you can take those lessons and then apply them. One thing that you've said is that what questions should you ask today? And then what decisions made that honor your future self? I'd love your input on that.
So this is just, remember earlier, I alluded to the whole thinking for a change and creating sacred space. And I keep going back to this subconscious brain. It wants to create the best world for you possible, but it only knows how to answer the question you give it. And so the idea is, the bigger the question, the bigger the opportunity, and the bigger the decision that could be life-changing. And I hosted a 5-year future self workshop. Part of this gift is, again, that I think in the very middle of the book, the operations manual piece I alluded to earlier, there's an entire step-by-step process that I share, that I teach in a 4-hour workshop with how to craft your perfect you in 5 years. And by the way, what I've learned too is that there are lots of people who are really good and successful in certain categories, but not necessarily good in every category. And by the way, you don't have to be. You just want to make sure that if you deny yourself a certain category or you ignore it, that it doesn't later become cancerous and debilitating, either physically, health, family, friends, experiences. And so I've crafted this life wheel, and you can find it at rickhale.com, www.rickhale.com, under the tools tab. And if you share your email address, which I promise not to spam, I just send quality information and tools that I come across to help the people that really want a hand up. And so if you rate yourself 1 to 10 in all these categories, and then it's easier to recognize pieces and parts that, what can I add to that to push the number forward and live a regret-free life? And so that's an important piece of this conversation. And in the middle of it, there's a process for how to craft your 5-year future self. And what I've learned coaching and consulting, realize that adventure in franchising and opening offices started with one small investment in one office. And when I saw the magic of leadership and I saw the magic of influence and recruiting and then helping enhance the lives of the people that choose to operate inside of our tribe, it was like a massive amount of gasoline on a fire. And I was so exciting and exhilarating to be a part of a company with culture and character and God, family, and business, doing it for the right reasons and the right order and priority. And how do we educate and train people in a way that makes their holistic experience better, not just how to sell another house? And I'm like, man, this is where I'm supposed to be. I ended up opening 6 offices and running 8 at one point. And like you said, I just pinch myself that I get to be in the presence of so many people. But what I've witnessed over and over is that people set these annual goals and they're great. Like they're wonderful. And if I polled 50 people right now in a room of any profession and said, who has really big goals? Almost 95 or 100% raise their hands. If I said, are you 100% sure you're going to hit them? Half of the hands go down. And it's a sobering reality that we set goals we just know we're not going to hit, or at least subconsciously don't believe in, or your hand wouldn't go down. Certainly not in May. We happen to be sitting here mid-May. Why would you give up? You got 7 months, 6 months anyway to hit. You've got margin to make up for any shortfall so far. And so in the reality of the way the mind works, I think annual goals are a bit of a setup. I think you need them and they're important. But if you can't take those goals and filter them down to a daily list of things that have to happen, that if you did 5 days in a row makes for a perfect, awesome week, and then 4 weeks in a row make for a personal awesome month, and then stack it up, it becomes an awesome year. That's part of the equation. The other thing is because subconsciously we're afraid of our own failure or success, what I think we can accomplish in 5 years, and that lens is completely different than what people propose in their annual goals. And so the workshop's all about thinking 5 years down the road. So you give yourself the luxury of a decompressed thought. Okay, I probably can't do it in the next 10 or 11 months, but give me 5 years. Most people are like, holy cow, like I could do anything in 5 years. And so it gives your brain and your subconscious mind, your heart, time to take a deep breath and go, what matters most? And we use all 12 categories in the process to make sure that you don't forfeit one category for another that ultimately proves detrimental to a relationship or an experience. And I help craft a holistic success story 5 years from now and let it really like plant big seeds and then water and fertilize that over the long run and let the world answer your question as you go and grow into that goal or into that dream, if you will. I'm not sure I exactly answered.
No, it is. It's progress. Every single day, every single week, every single month, growing and getting better in your own journey.
Yeah, it's small steps. It's small steps successfully made. There's an analogy that was shared with me at one point that it's not about 180-degree changes today, because that's really hard to break a habit or to recreate or reinvent yourself. It's really hard. I struggle with the same thing, because no matter where you are, there's a reinvention opportunity. It doesn't matter. You may have climbed one summit, but as you get to the top of that summit, you'll see other summits that didn't even exist until you had the view from the top of the one you just climbed. And so that's part of this life worth living piece, where it's a collection of small experience stacked end to end. And the biggest regret I would have had is that my steps weren't progressive and that I just was walking in circles. Let that land. Are you walking in circles or are you climbing? At least climb the peak you aim to climb first, and then and then decide again.
Yeah, I think it's a great lesson if you step back and you look at, there's a lot of people that think, oh, I didn't do well at this, or I'm older, or the thing that I'm taking away from this in this conversation personally. And I think we all think internally of the things that we struggle with, but there's no end. There's no finish line. You're just going towards the next big project. And so if you constantly keep that in your mind, I think that, wow, what a positive force that is to know that if you're frustrated where you are, there's always another mountain that you can climb, something else that you can tackle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then live today. That's the other piece of it. Once the 5-year future self workshop, or the strategy behind taking a look at all 12 categories of life. And I think I've covered just about anything anyone would want to achieve, or at least sustain and maintain. Just make sure you're checking all the boxes. And if you've got a view 5 years from now and it reflects in your day planner today and this week and this month, there's no way that progress doesn't fuel that back to your heart and mind, an energy that you're on a purposeful path. And that's an inspired way to live. And the goal is just not to forget or leave things behind so that you wake up regretful. And health is one of those, an easy one to look at and go, man, am I in optimal health? Because it's the one thing you can't buy back. And all the others can be worked on and honed. But once you suffer health, it's the one thing that in a minute can make you irrelevant to the universe because you're unable to perform. So it just constant small reminders and small steps in the right direction are really what pay off in the long run.
Wow. It's great to hear. You close out, we're getting close to the hour, and I could talk to you for another 2 or 3 hours. So we'll have to come back to this and have a part 2 one day. But you talk about reframing your mindset. Tell me as we close out how someone can do that, because I think that was a great message.
In some ways, it's literally take an honest assessment of where you are today. And I think without integrity, and by the way, here's how I define integrity. I define integrity as when your inside voice aligns with your outside behavior. And so there's lots of ways to define it, but in my world, it's when you say when you look in the mirror and you're alone and you're in your heart and head and you say, here are all the things that make me. These are all the things I either have or want or could do or want to do or I'm striving for. But when your outside behavior doesn't reflect it and there's not a plan to support it, that's a discouraging reality that your subconscious brain has to absorb. And it's not positive food, if you will. It's not positive feedback. And so when you say reframing, I think step one is to take an honest look at where you are and not reflect. And this is something I learned early on too. Don't judge your insides by other people's outsides. In other words, it's real easy to look at social media and say, damn, they're in Fiji this week, or they just bought a Ferrari, or they're fill in the blank, whatever it is that you go, why didn't I do that? I should be. That's outside looking. You're looking out at somebody thinking they figured it out because of a circumstantial best day ever post. It's their highlight reel, if you will. So the importance of reframing, one is the integrity and the honesty and the authenticity of a conversation with yourself around who am I, what am I, and where am I? And the where am I is like GPS only works when there's 2 coordinates, the one where you are and the one where you want to go. So the reframing starts with an honest look at every category. Am I shorting myself a gift by sliding that category? And again, we've got everything from travel and leisure to financial to career and education. We've got health, family, relationships with friends. We've got romance on the list, spirituality. As I get older, that becomes a massive topic among my peers, particularly, who are killing it in every quadrant, but are working on that one. And that one's as important as health, in my humble opinion. So are you working on it or are you waiting on it? And if you're waiting on it, one day it may be too late. And so that's a vital part of this conversation of reframing. So recognizing where you are, step one. Step two, simply scripting out each bubble. Make it easy. The easiest way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time, which is the most ridiculous analogy. I've never eaten an elephant. No one I know has. But it's something big and hard to imagine. So if you were going to, you couldn't do it in one bite. So the idea is like, what first bite would I make to move that category one step closer to that better version of me? And then project out 5 years. What would awesome look like in that category? And it's much easier to dissect it in pieces and parts. And I think, Stacey, the reframing piece of the conversation is, what do I have to do categorically, one small step at a time, that feeds my subconscious mind and my heart and soul in a way that feels fulfilling and inspiring to take a second step and a third step. And the analogy of a boat sailing between continents, I started to say this earlier, someone shared this, like you don't, 180-degree turns are almost impossible. If you're completely out of shape, to sign up for a marathon tomorrow would be a huge mistake, and it'd be humbling and probably disheartening. But if you said, I'm going to run a marathon in 16 or 18 months or 2, man, all of a sudden, I just need to buy a good pair of running shoes and walk to the mailbox. That's step one. Step two, I'll walk to my neighbor's mailbox. Step three, I'll run to the mailbox. And it's like little things all of a sudden stacked. And one day you wake up a new person and a different person. And the reframe comes from giving yourself tangible steps that are achievable and believable. And so that's where the process in the book, I think, pays dividends, because you're able to craft breadcrumbs to that ultimate best version. And I break it into categories so that it doesn't feel like holistically overwhelming. Because if I said, I want you to be your awesome, perfect, awesome, amazing, unbelievable, better than everyone else in the world, best tomorrow, you're like, yeah, right. But if I said, in each category, what one thing could you do to move towards that ultimate goal, whether it's a year, 5 or 10 years down the road? All of a sudden, the reframe comes when you go, I can do that. I've got this. I just need to schedule it in my day planner and make it a non-negotiable appointment with myself or with someone that helps me get there. Because again, some of these steps in the right direction aren't what, it's who. Who can facilitate that I feel accomplished in that category without actually having to double down and learn something or do something I'm either not good at, skilled at, or even aware of what to do next.
So many lessons in that. I absolutely loved it. My favorite, are you working on it or are you waiting on it? That's going to be my new motto. I just love it.
Thank you.
I just really did. I've enjoyed our conversation so much. And as I said, we're just going to have to schedule more time. I'm lucky to be able to get to talk with you personally and to have a friendship with you. And I cherish the time that you've spent with us. I think that a lot of people, once they hear your message, are going to need and make plans to buy your book, because it is something that I'm really getting a lot out of, and it does make you think. So I do love that you're pouring into everyone else with your
Awesome.
life lessons.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You have a gift that the world needs, and I appreciate that you're taking time and energy to find cool people to have cool conversations that are down to earth and real. I think making a difference is just one conversation at a time, and I've loved our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And for everyone out there that is watching, thank you for joining me on This Wobbly Life. Hope that you'll be on the next one, and have a great day. I'm Stacey King, your host for This Wobbly Life. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you on the next one.